Alright, hello everyone and welcome to the semifinals of this year's Great Gender Debates. We have Yuki Mara with OG, SMU with CG, EP with OO, and Taylor with CO. Mariana, I'll be your chair. Along with me are Latif, Dr. Zuliana, Habib, Sherilyn. Debating on the motion, this House believes that feminists in the developing world should forward ecofeminism. We now call on the Honorable Prime Minister to deliver the motion that stands in his name.
The problem in status quo right now is that there's a fetishization of economic development in developing countries, that they prioritize these sort of movements, these sort of developments over things as simple as social rights, in particular the social rights of women. So side opening government's goal right now is to demystify and break that link or break that fetish of these developing nations in order to create some form of balance between the rights of women in these countries as well as economic development, because we don't think we need to sacrifice one over the other. So the goal inside opening government is to create that balance, create relatability in order for you to start some form of discussion over feminist movements and the rights of women in this country in order for these two movements to move in tandem with one another. Therefore, there will be two parts of this debate, right? The first is the philosophical view of how these sort of two ideas can link to one another and how we view the environment akin to women. And the second part is the practical aspects of relating these two notions and how people will perceive it. Therefore, it will not be sufficient for opposition to come out in this debate and say simply that there is no link between the environment and women. We think that this debate, they have to somehow show an alternative and how you're supposed to move feminist movements in this country ahead alongside the development that happens in these nations. So I have two arguments in my speech. Firstly, I'll tell you how these developing nations view these feminist movements and why is it better on our side when you create that point of relatability. Secondly, I'll tell you the abstract links of how we view women and the environment and the pernicious harms that happen in status quo. Firstly, let's talk about how developing nations view feminist movements. Because, we have to acknowledge that the end goal of developing nations is to reach a point of economic stability. Therefore, in the reaching of these goals, more often than not, they sort of forget things like social movements and social rights, and they forward things like being able to make more money. Therefore, these are the nations like India and Pakistan or even Malaysia that forward things like heavy industrialization, things like often polluting the environment, often raising the forest in the ground, but in return, they do not have a semblance of a movement or enough rights to forward to women. Therefore, when you look at the social standings of women, they don't even, in some countries, it does not extend to, for example, the right to even get education or the right to even derive some form of benefit from the economic benefit that they've already derived from the environment. So this is important because right now you have to understand that these are countries that have a very form of they do not view the feminist movement as something that's very relatable to them. More often than not, they view the feminist movement as a movement that A, is a Western imposition and therefore not in tandem with their goals. But secondly, we think that's hard for them to link with things such as immediate goals of the feminist movement, things like being able to get sexual autonomy or even divorcing the idea of autonomy from their husbands immediately, right? So we think that at this point in time, the question then becomes how best does these movements create a starting point or create a link in order to start those movements, in order to gain some form of traction. And we think it's true ecofeminism. Why? Because the way you view the environment and the way you link it to economic development, that's immediately you can create some form of link to how you view women. Because we believe, and we'll argue to you, that these people in developing countries view women the same way how they view environments. That's often replenishable, that's often subservient to the needs of the entire country. Similar to how you view women and housewives as serving their men, these are countries who view the environment in a similar way how you have to serve the better purpose of our country without us having to care for the environmental rights in beginning. So we think that creates a parallel on on how you view these two ideas. The way the feminist movement then comes out and say, look, the way you're treating me now is similar to how you're treating the environment, and that's wrong. That's when you create a visceral impact on how you harm the environment and create a link on how you harm women's rights. So therefore, if you're unable to proceed with creating more, like protecting the environment, making sure it's sustainable and will fall and will move in tandem with the goals of your society, the same way you can create that link. If you don't protect women, these are probably the same harms that will happen to you. The visceral impact that happens on your economy can be linked to how you treat women, and because this is the main stakeholder in developing countries, that's where people are more likely to respond to your pleas for more rights. And we think that that's the important link that feminist movements have to create. So you have to compare it in status quo right now. In status quo, there is no point of which these movements can create some form of discussion. We think that when you create a direct link and how you impact the environment as well as related to the plight of women, at least you can create the discussion. So yeah, while we might concede that discussion might not always go to their way, it might be rocky or whatnot, but at least you say that, look, there is a link. If you harm the environment, it's akin and parallel to how you harm women in these countries. And we think that that's the important form of discourse in this debate. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
When ecofeminism wants to blame male dominance, who exactly are the main actors of this male dominance? Are they CEOs of logging companies? Or are they men on the ground?
Okay, look, regardless, right? If you're talking about CEOs, the power structure is still controlled by men. If you're talking about politicians in patriarchal societies, it's still controlled by men. So you, more often than not, you have to homogenize it to men in these countries as well. So if you link it to men always caring about economic development, that's where feminists should come out and say, look, your priorities are skewed, you should focus on our rights as well, right? Let's talk about the abstract things, right? Because we think that the way in which you raise the environment and the way in which you deal with the environment is often a power play by these patriarchal societies to demonstrate that sort of power you have over these nations. So similarly to how you tie abstracts of nature to things like Mother Nature, or how you link or you use the pronoun of her for countries, right? Or similarly to how you refer to Mother Earth, right? And similarly to how you are able to link nature to the characteristics of women. Things like they're supposed to cultivate life. Things like you're supposed to protect them and be able, and they're supposed to grow in tandem, right? These are things that are immediately relatable to these patriarchal societies because they're not distinct from the immediate notions of things like societal constructs, like being a housewife, or religious constructs that immediately tell you have to, like women are supposed to be like sexual beings or whatnot, right? The relatability you create then is that you have to protect these women the same way you protect their environment because these are where, things grow. This is how you cultivate life. This is how you ensure a sustainable sort of development for these countries. And that's the link that's important. But right now, the show of power immediately compromises the position of women, and we think that that's harmful because it's pernicious to the point where you tell people that if you relate women to the environment, you are showing dominance over them in order for your own goals. And we think the feminist movement can never strive from that. I've never been proud of to propose.
OG is correct in characterizing the end goal of every developing nation is for development. But the question is what comes with this development, right? It comes with international scrutiny. It comes with you being forced to prioritize human rights. But we tell you tangling human rights and environmental issues, which are both complex issues, becomes a complexity in itself. And I'll explain this further. I have two arguments for you today. Firstly, on how this affects women, and secondly, how this affects men. But firstly, on this whole comparative of how developing nations, firstly, we tell you as an example, after Brazil developed further, right, it managed to clean up its environment and clean up the damage that's done. That's not the debate today, right? But secondly, we tell you that when he himself conceded that feminism ideas are difficult to accept, We think that governments who would want to further development will be reluctant to even forward environmental technology, because as sustainable as it is, it's difficult to invest in. When you accrue feminism with this sort of environmental issues, then it becomes much more difficult to forward these sort of ideas, right? Because why? We tell you when it comes to developing nations where you have limited resources, we tell you that their visceral impact doesn't work. Why? Because when environmentalists already find it difficult to progress their view, and when you want to amass them into your critical mass, means you either have to sacrifice environmental causes or feminist causes, because you can't push for both, because you can't satisfy both parties at the same time. There's no explanation, no practical outcomes as to however this would be achieved, as to how this compromise would be made by both parties. Maybe they can answer it. Our burden on opposition is just to prove the harms of this movement and prove how they would sacrifice the feminist movement, ladies and gentlemen. But firstly, on to my first argument, right, about how this affects women. We think that internalization that occurs is extremely problematic. Why? Because the narrative is that most of them will continue to belong in the agricultural sectors of the developing nations, because this is where we're putting the bait, right? We tell you that it becomes more difficult to push for women to go for other jobs. Why? Because they know they are more protected in those fields and therefore limited to only progressing within those fields. Because women are already disincentivized to join male-dominated fields within the developing nations, right? We tell you when you tie environmental movements and to feminist movements, means that the protection is only limited to within those sectors, and there is no push for other sectors, because the environmentalists want their job taken care of. They want the environmental to be taken care of as well. We think in this case, states needs to ensure equality in all formal sectors, right? But what happens under their paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, is that you only push for protection in those cases, ladies and gentlemen, because now they don't see a need to push elsewhere. The critical mass that I told you is a mass only for the environment. They've never told you how exactly these environmentalists would suddenly care and push for human rights as well. Never tell us how exactly those incentives of those individuals will suddenly change under the status quo. We tell you also that women who are in other jobs cannot ask for more protection in the workforce, because the focus is attached in the environmental, in the agricultural fields, ladies and gentlemen. We think those individuals will continue to be labeled negatively and pushed out of this job. The glass ceiling that then becomes that much harder to break, because even if they try to argue that men will become the protector of these individuals, it is benevolent sexism at its best, ladies and gentlemen, because then the superiority that these individuals will feel over protecting these women is not true equality in itself, ladies and gentlemen. It's just you feeling, I protected them, I'm a superior individual. We think then it becomes that much harder to push for the equality that feminism has always wanted to push from the very beginning, right? And this is a long-term harm, because, ladies and gentlemen, when they feel that they are superior, it becomes that much harder to change their minds, ladies and gentlemen, and try to push for the feminist movement at the end of the day. Before I go on, sure.
If you concede that there's limited political capital in these countries, but also concede there's a problem with development and pollution as well as feminist rights, why can't you relate those two problems, acknowledging that I've told you that there are links between these two?
Because, ladies and gentlemen, first I told you, because you have limited political capital, you either have to choose human rights, which is feminism rights in this case, or you have to choose environmentalist cause. Means you are sacrificing one of these two goals. But secondly, I told you, this is a short-term benefit. Even if they manage to progress both of these things, right, ladies and gentlemen, it becomes only attached to environmental views. It becomes harder to detach from that label. It becomes harder to detach environmental from human rights. It becomes much harder to progress human rights on its own. And in a developing nation context, this is extremely problematic, where the patriarchal society already exists, and this view of you being superior to women already exists. This is problematic, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, on how this affects men, we tell you that the narrative and antagonism will exist, right? Because the inherent narrative within the ecofeminism is that you blame men. In a patriarchal society, fine, we concede patriarchs will never join you anyway. But now the fence sitters, ladies and gentlemen, the people on the ground will be unwilling to join you. Why? Because they wouldn't want blame or hate attached to these individuals. It therefore becomes difficult to forward feminist progression, because you easily can attach, as they conceded, negative labels such as Western, it's a Western idea, ladies and gentlemen. It becomes much easier to attach the ideas of feminazism to these individuals, ladies and gentlemen, and it makes it harder to gain women's support or even men's support in this thing, right? So what we tell you then, it becomes more difficult to further other goals, right? Because we tell you already that feminist movements would not gain support from those in defending the environment because they've never proven that link, right? But when even women or men already fear joining you, the feminism labels that are attached to negative rhetoric becomes much more difficult to remove, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the resilience towards these individuals then wanting to change a sort of view, resilience towards changing the sort of point of views becomes that much more difficult. So what have I told you? I've told you three things actually. I've told you about how this affects women, right? About the internalization that they belong to the agriculture sector and they will never be protected. We've told you about how these individuals in other sectors will now have more fear and are more disincentivized to join these fields, right? Because now they will be more oppressed in those situations and they don't see any protection coming their way. I've told you about how the negative labels will be further attached to the feminist movement and how by attaching it to environmentalists becomes much more difficult to detach and to find other labels and to progress the feminist movement. I've told you about how this affects men and how the negative antagonism means it's much more difficult to gain the support of feminists on the ground and much more difficult to find support from men and women for your cause. If you are for feminist rights, female rights in developing nations, you will go with opening opposition.
We then continue to talk. We now move on to the Prime Minister. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is an evaluation of how we best forward social movements that not only pinpoints a focus on feminism, as well as protecting the environment, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, we will contest from opening government that you do not need to sacrifice one over another because we don't think you take away a position from one social movement just because you say there are potential harms that can exist in status quo. The first thing I'm going to point out in this debate is that she missed the entirety of the nuance in Moya's speech as to how individuals necessarily perceive the environment and how individuals perceive women and how do we best create a point of relation at the point in which the feminist movement is viewed as a foreign imposition to how individuals view them, ladies and gentlemen. The second thing I'm going to talk about is how we best gain political capital at the point in which these two movements can now collectivize together in order to ensure there is a larger movement to how they best create change. The rest of my rebuttals will be integrated, but before that, several points of rebuttal that don't necessarily fit in. The first thing I'm going to argue and reject is that this notion that you create a culture of antagonism in the way in which the patriarchy reacts to you. We will agree in some instances that the patriarchy will be necessarily adverse to reaction to change. But if you accept the policy of like wanting to create change in opposition and often prioritizing the economic development, oftentimes we don't have the ability to translate the ability for them to relate to feminism to begin with. Secondly, we will argue the way in which she painted the world right now in developing nations often means that they are unable to even forward feminist goals to begin with, because oftentimes you will have to take some antagonistic position in how you challenge power structures to how men view women as well as how they relate it to other points of relatability in society. No, thank you. Therefore, we will argue, at least on the outside, you create a starting point to how the discussion then starts because there's a point of relatability. What is that point of relatability, ladies and gentlemen? Here's my second rebuttal. Because they say it will be very hard right now for you to detract and divorce the idea of environment and feminist right, ladies and gentlemen, because they say there's benevolent sexism, therefore we will never be comparative. But we don't think this is comparative, right? Because we think the first trade-off in the first instance that we are willing to make is that at least there is a change in the way in which people view them, because there are some individuals who can be rational in the discussion in which we say there is a point of relation. Because, right, the ability for you to relate the environment and say no thank you is that it is more relatable and more visceral because the environment is such a big part of their life. It's their economic opportunity as well as where they derive natural resources, ladies and gentlemen. So we will say that the first trade-off that we are willing to make is that at least there is a starting point in the discussion in which we say that you have to start making a concession in how you view these two particular aspects, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, we will argue that the ability for you to grant early rights, something that we'll talk about within my collectivization argument, means that you are able to create a larger ability of individuals who want to create change to begin with. Because we think at the point in which you want social justice and social rights, ladies and gentlemen, you have to be able to create a
starting point in the way in which people want to engage with you, especially the feminist movement. No, thank you. So, secondly, about the point of connection between the environment and women, right? We told you in Moya's speech that the way in which people in developing nations often view these two separate identities is that it is a dispensable position in society, it is a subservient position that serves a larger goal. So oftentimes, women serve a larger goal of having to bred children to cater to the patriarchy, of having to care for men in the patriarchy. No, thank you. And the environment acts in the same way, because the way in which we view the environment is that it's often dispensable at the point in which we can get economic development and sacrifice our natural resources. This is the point of connection. And it's at this particular juncture, the way in which people view feminism right now is that it is a foreign concept, because it is often tied to things like sexual liberation or forwarding my identity in the way in which a white woman in a developed nation does, ladies and gentlemen. And this sort of rhetoric is easily rebuttable, because the concept in which you are forwarding this notion is foreign and often viewed as radical, ladies and gentlemen. So how do you best engage with the different categories of patriarchal societies? Then a point of information from opposing opposition. We think that when you talk about the power structures within this particular countries, ladies and gentlemen, there is an ability for you to make them accountable, at least to understand what it necessarily means for you to sacrifice environments as well as social justice for individuals within status quo. Ladies and gentlemen, sit down, guys, stop heckling. Because we will argue, right, the economic opportunity that you can glean and tell individuals that is something that is necessarily important. You tell them that you cannot often sacrifice something like your environment just because there's a rhetoric of it being dispensable, because in the far off future, the environment won't be there to sustain your country to begin with. The same parallel can be said to women as well. That you can't always treat women in this particular way, because there's a large number of them within status quo that you can utilize as meaningful members of society, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, do you need to sacrifice one over another? No, because we will argue that the conservation of environment doesn't take away anything from women, and giving rights to females in communities doesn't take anything away from the conservation of the environment, ladies and gentlemen. So how do we best get political capital in a developing world? Firstly, I'm going to argue and characterize what does political capital look like, especially for social movements like environmental conservationists as well as feminist movement. Before that, I'll take opening. If both causes, environment and feminism, are so difficult to find support, why would suddenly a linkage of both lead to more support?
Yeah, this is my argument, and that's why I'm going to answer your question, right? So firstly, we will argue that oftentimes things like the environment and women are often immutable ideas that are dispensable, because people don't see an objective benefit to wanting to give them rights to begin with. So oftentimes, your political capital is very limited in the way in which people want to perceive you, right? So what happens right now, ladies and gentlemen, is that regrettably you have to derive strength from numbers, as well as having the ability to show power and respect in that particular regard. Therefore, we will argue, when feminist movement take a position of forwarding ecofeminism, what it allows for it to happen is that the ability for them to collectivize with environmental protectionist groups and say that we have a united goal to forward. Oftentimes, when political capital is limited, who is often sacrificed are feminist movements as well as environmental groups, because there is a notion and rhetoric that exists in status quo that you are dispensable and we don't need to give it to you right now because at least we have economic benefit, ladies and gentlemen. What we can do right now is that we can capitalize on that political capital and compound on the idea that these things are important in status quo, because as two groups of a different identity and fighting for two different things, we are coming together to show you that these two things are important and you should not ignore us, ladies and gentlemen. So what it allows for these groups is that the ability for them to at least enter a position of discussion in a larger number of communities to show that there is strength and solidarity in a position that we are not dispensable and you ought not to sacrifice us, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we think that there are people in status quo in developing nations, not just debaters, but other people who are, slightly more intellectually able, can also glean the idea that feminist movement as well as environmental protection is something that is necessarily important. But the way in which they want to engage with people who don't understand these things are important is of a different level together, and comparatively a lot harder, because it's a lot harder for an individual who is a layman who necessarily believes in the patriarchal values as well as like environmental sacrificing the environment to be able to understand an intellectual discussion as to why do we need to protect feminism as well as why do we need to protect the environment. What you do right now is that you give people the ability to have a relatable discussion as well as the ability for them to have an objective justification as to why we need to give rights to these two individuals anyway. We think that this is a point of authority that is powerful. We think that this is meaningful. I've never been proud. Thank you, Prime Minister. To close the opening for this debate, we now call on the Deputy Leader of the Session. Here.
PM came to us and talked about how we can fight for 2 votes. And then DPM comes to us and talks about that there needs to be a unification of votes. So clearly conceding to opposition that clearly we have no political capital to invest on both. But even in the unification goal, under their side, I will tell you how the change of narrative and stance regarding environmental fight will cause you to lose all the support you actually had garnered so far for the environmental fights to begin with, right? Today I'll just do 2 things and everything will be integrated within my speech. First, I'll tell you how they will create a lack of linkage within the fight for both of these movements in the very first place. Secondly, I will also talk about how the narrative of development country works when it comes down to dispensable things, which Jay did not completely explain well in this house today, right? First of all, let's tackle the idea of linkage of ideas, right? First of all, let's take a look at how both environment and the feminist group are right now in these developing nations, right? First of all, their characterization is feminist movement is Western. Fine, we'll accept that characterization. Secondly, we believe there's a fight for environment. But now, we believe, which one would you opt for now, right? A movement which you don't think is Western, but is much more concerning regarding you, that is a movement you would much more concern to. If their relativity idea is unifying them, will suddenly remove the Western imposition that they're conceding themselves, right? Because now you're saying even the environmental factor becomes something that is entied with the feminist movement and also becomes a Western imposition under your side. No, sit down. So that itself is a logical contradiction. But even if I were to consider that these two are now unified, what happens now is the harm that Nithya talked about, that you look like you're the overseer and protector of all. The benevolent sexism still occurs at the very first. That is a harm. And secondly, there's also could be reasons for you to not follow that goal in the very first place. Why? Now because you're going to have to opt into ideas that you were previously not agreeing to in the very first place. So now this antagonism or the alienation of those ideas will cause you to lose support in the environmental phases as well, because now people will now move away from those ideas. So clearly, the linkage of ideas necessarily do not work in this very first place, and it's a failure of government trying to show that. No, I'll take it later. Trying to show that there is a linkage in the very first place. There's logical gaps almost, and I believe people cannot relate to both environment and women at the same time almost. We believe in a developing country, you have to give them incentives on how protecting environment itself should be the main aim almost, and not give them incentives to things that they already regard not part of development almost. That will further incentivize them to not look at those environmental aspects in the very first place when you try to push for feminist idea throughout. So that needed to be clarified from government, how this would be interpreted better from the environmental perspective when you push for feminist ideas in the very first place. So nothing really goes on. And that even in your best case scenario, you still suffer the idea of men thinking they are way more superior, and the protectionism goes under there, and all the harm of women not rising up the hierarchy and tying their son to agriculture will still exist under your side. And that is how the movement itself becomes a negative movement and does not push forward in the very first place. But before I move on to the second point, yes.
So you just considered in your speech that we will be more palatable to things like environmental goals because it links to economic progress. So when you divorce feminist goals from Western ideals like sexual autonomy, and link it to things like environment progress, don't you think you can create more political capital then?
No, that doesn't work. If you tie these both together, your narrative of environmental goal already changes, Honorable Speaker, because you're supporting feminist idea, which you talk about as Western imposition. That itself is a problem in the very first place, Honorable Speaker. And we believe you've garnered less attention towards it at the very first place. They still haven't proved to us why that linkage would be something viewed mono in the very first place. But let's move on to economical development, right? And let's characterize how developing countries work. Environment has always been something that's dispensable, agreed by open government as well, right? But they haven't told us how suddenly when you link women into these fields would cause you to not be looked at something dispensable. Jay's answer to that was that now you will have a united goal and you will gain numbers. If that was the case, we don't need to suffer the negativism of antagonizing men in this case. Women can just support the idea of ecofeminism, and people will garner those ideas. But now, under your side, when you support the idea of ecofeminism, you're actively blaming and antagonizing men at this very moment. So you lose support at that very first place, and all those support that have been garnered for those movements are also gone at the very first place. So you become much likely to be more dispensable at that very first place, and something that they can easily discard of at the very first place on the speaker. So they have to show us how these political capital would work. They talked about fence-sitters on the speaker. Nithya already mentioned how these fence-sitters would now be actively pushed away from these goals in the very first place, and now you won't even have them on those fights in the very first place. When countries focus on economical development, it is wise for us to push for incentives that better benefits them, right? When you create this relativism, you're making the burden much harder for them. You're giving them much more harder burdens to do when it comes down to economical gain. So this is what would actively start to drive them away from pushing forward this goal, and think of it as something that they should actively discard and move forward, something they could not buy and move on for economical development. No, so these are now problems that will become much persistent in society. So you do not have any change of views necessarily in society. Much more, you become a movement that becomes more dispensable, and in the end, something that easily is discardable in the very first place on Africa. Because in the end, developing, we believe, a much better stance is to push forward development in its own Africa, and then movements such as human rights movements, those things are much more beneficial in the very first place, and can be much more conducive in a country that progresses developing much faster in those rates, right? We cannot now push back countries into those failures, into those states where they would now take an active stance of discarding or socially engineer a country or nation that will actively think that women are protected minorities in the very first place. So harms will exist under your side. We believe alternatives already exist in society, which looks forward economical rights and women's rights in the very first place, and they have been doing a pretty good job, Honorable Speaker. We believe women are getting the protection necessary, Honorable Speaker. We do not think why this necessary social engineering that they wanted to talk about would work in society, Honorable Speaker. Rather than that, you create a society that will always think women are minorities and will think that they require protection. Rather than that, this is a worst debate that OG could be in.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Leader. All who kindly open the closing hat and will now call out the number of suffering.
Madam Speaker, the devastating impacts of climate change are so great that traditional women's rights issues in the developing world become irrelevant when their lives are turned upside down by climate change. The feminist movement asks us to be strategic and deal with this elephant in the room. That finally doing something about climate change before it's too late is important because it best protects women, because it protects the most number of women in the long term. And we do this in 3 ways, as we're going to explain. This means, Madam Speaker, that all case about like harms or whatnot become unstrategic and short-termist because they don't think about the long-term goals, about the necessary impacts climate change has upon the world, especially the developing world. Let's explain this. Because we know, for example, how climate change is screwing the world up. The haze this year was so bad because the El Nino effect was unusually strong. Why? Because climate change. We see more destructive natural disasters like Typhoon Haiyan or Cyclone Najis. Why? Because climate change. We see villages being gone, like flooding last December in Malaysia, right? The run-up to worlds. More mudslides, right? Why? Because, say it with me, climate change. We think lots and lots of people are affected by this, right? Like when women are displaced, sit down, right, are hurt more because like men have more resources, are able to find their ways to refugee camps or find their ways to other countries much more easily, for example, right, where they are better able to escape. We see this as a parallel for this, we look at the kind of refugees who are appearing in Europe. Most of them are males and have needs and resources to travel in spite of coming from poor developing countries, because men do have control of these resources, but even though men and women are getting hurt, sit down. We think that a greater emphasis on climate change when the feminist movement joins hands with the green movement means a few things. It means one, stronger lobbying power to help effect change, because we think feminist movement is a lot stronger than the green movement, right? Because generally it's larger and it's a lot easier to relate to people being hurt than an amorphic idea of climate being hurt. And more importantly, when the feminist movement is also able to mobilize more people to their cause, that there are a lot more people who are active in the feminist movement than in the green movement. We think that when millions of men and women, especially women, will lose have any semblance of normal life destroyed by climate change, and thousands more will die during effects of haze or cyclones, typhoons, floods, mudslides, and what have you, Madam Speaker. We think first, protection of the environment means protection of the most number of women in the long term. It also means the protection of men, which we obviously think is a good thing. But second, and more importantly, rights like trying to institute anti-discrimination laws, or trying to break down the patriarchy in these conservative states about perceptions of men and women, Madam Speaker, become irrelevant when you'll be living in a refugee camp, when you will be when you'll be starving every day, when the village is swept away, Madam Speaker. We think that when climate change is a threat to our most basic human rights to survive, to food security, to water security, to having clean air, for example. We think these more basic rights require protection, and require protection today, Madam Speaker. It becomes important for feminist movement to recognize that these rights are under threat as well, and we need to protect it, Madam Speaker. The future of the feminist movement lies on the fact that we are able to protect all of women's rights, and this means rights which are seen as human rights as well, food security and water security, Madam Speaker. Before I go on, I will take a point of closing.
Tell us an example of this pushing forward of ecofeminism. Is it activism or eco-terrorism or even education campaigns?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily support eco-terrorism, for example. We think or maybe we would, but that's not really relevant. But we think generally, the feminist movement, to the extent that it is significantly larger, has significantly stronger lobby power, it can help better change laws to protect, to regulate industries, for example. It can help change social norms with regard to the way we treat the environment. It means that it changes the ways that we want to build our economy, for example. It's quite unfortunate that CEO wasn't listening to OG's speech, because they said some of those things, and I have to say that with greater specificity, not that keyword. Right? So let's move on, right, and talk about how this is necessarily also better for perception of women in that longer term as well, in a world where we have perhaps been able to better deal with the climate, because this changes norms and perception of women. Because people will be thinking, hey, this woman actually quite useful. They tell us, because climate change is quite a relatable thing, right? That there's more and more farmers in India who are committing suicide because the monsoon season is getting less and less predictable, right? That they realize that women are fighting for a cause that affects them as well, Madam Speaker. We think that it necessarily it necessarily benefits them because these, especially men in rural areas, because these are the people who are most likely by the patriarchal norms, right? That the women find that, and this necessarily responds if they're lost, when they talk about any sort of loss of support, right? Because when we talk about loss of economic rights, we think we are better able to protect our paradigm when Indian farmers don't have to commit suicide, because the weather patterns become a lot more predictable. For example, they don't have devastating crops, or rather have crops that are devastating and have low yields, and therefore commit suicide because they're not able to pay off those loans to farm those crops in the first place. We think this has really placed because men perceive women as better as allies, and so I think that's a good thing, that kind of perception of allies. But more than that, Madam Speaker, it also shows that feminism cares about men. When we note large discourse today, Madam Speaker, about how women's rights care only about women and not about human rights. We think when we are able to draw these two things together and say that women's rights are human rights too, for example, the feminist movement does support stuff that men can relate to. We think we are able to get better by it in the long term, because when we have really realized that women can be correct on certain things, maybe they're correct on other things as well. And that's the ultimate message that we want women's society. This means that large parts of the whole case become largely irrelevant to this debate because they fail to see these long-term goals that ecofeminism is able to bring about. What have I shown you in today's debate, Madam Speaker? I've told you this, that the devastating impacts of climate change are so great that we need to do something about it right now, because the long-term impacts means other stuff becomes less relevant. Right? If you are living in a refugee camp, or if you're not even able to get yourself to a refugee camp, and your village is washed away and you are like just drowning, or you die, Madam Speaker, we don't think the feminist movement is very good at protecting dead people.
Thank you, Member of Government. To extend the op-ed, should we now call out the Member of Opposition?
To the patriarchal mind, when you relate climate change to women, you relate something you already don't care about to something you care even less about. We tell you that in order to garner support, and if it's true what opening government and closing government say, that male dominance is to blame for environmental destruction, it is these patriarchal minds that we must change in the first place. Closing government tells you that the perception of women will change when they relate themselves to the environmental cause. We tell you that we don't think it's possible for men to see women as better when the very crux of environmental ecofeminism tells you that to blame men and male dominance for it. I think that's even more harmful because now not only do women have to antagonize the men, but males now have a reason to antagonize females further. I think that's harmful in general. But the main problem with both closing government and opening government is this idea that we are pushing forward a short-term benefit in exchange for a long-term benefit. But we tell you it's longer term on our side because when the main crux of opening government tells you that the relatability between women and men, women and environment is fundamental to their fight. That is exactly this link that is harmful in the long term. You know that even if we concede to everything that Moya said, that these two sufferings can be likened and that they are principally aligned. These are movements that we are talking about. These are movements where fights are essential. So with every fight is about strategy, which is the best strategy that can further both fights. We think on our side, we can do that better. That's because this link compounds the apathy and hatred for both sides. We tell you that not only do I not care about the environment, but the women that I don't care about and often hate are blaming me for it. And that these are the ones that will eventually turn people off, turn men off, and that men will also get threatened and more defensive in general. This pushes a lot of men away from the environmental movement, but also away from feminism as a whole. Their strategy on that side, that this discourse that they were supposedly talking about becomes even more harmful because of that specific principle antagonization as a whole. But also, do they get more political capital? In a patriarchal society that also doesn't care about environment, that also prioritizes economical development more, we think that this association is harmful for both. Because feminists in patriarchal societies, feminists are likened to feminazis, whereas environmental activists are likened to hippies or eco-terrorists. Right? When you have our existing political capital on both, but now have to relate both of them together, you then turn off existing people within each of these within each of those movements. We also turn off other people from outside who could have been entered your movements in the first place. And that's how we take down both CG and OG, right? But also, what did opening opposition tell you? Opening opposition gave this general idea that essentially you cannot have both because you antagonize men in general, you therefore lower critical mass. We will tell you that that their fight won't be successful and that we can have both better on our side when we separate these fights. We will also tell you how the real entities of male dominance, and environmental destruction, like logging companies or oil companies, will further harm this fight for both of them. Before I move on, yes, please.
If your largest contention is not wanting to antagonize the strong patriarchy that you are so scared of, can you tell us a succinct way in which people are able to relate to a point of relation for both fights to be able to progress?
We don't think there needs to be a relation in the first place. This relation is harmful within this patriarchal society. So the strategy has always been, whenever it comes to feminism or environmental movements, is not to make the perpetrator in a defensive. It is a slow and progressive movement, like how we slowly encourage more women into parliament, or how we slowly encourage more eco-friendly laws. These are things that are slow progressions that we don't force people to antagonize us. The moment that they antagonize us, that puts men in a way that they won't listen to us at all and will actually treat us as someone who shouldn't be taken seriously and and a group that should actually be attacked for. I think that there are priorities when it comes to movements as a whole. So the feminist movement has a priority on getting better jobs or better education or better treatment for women in general. These are the main priorities when it comes to movements like this. So even though yes, environment might be a factor within feminism that we should talk about, but it's not something in a developing country where we need to prioritize larger things first. So this explains to you what I'm going to talk about, right? How exactly do we make both of these fights successful? Because feminism has certain priorities when it comes to feminism as a whole, especially in developing countries. What you then do from this antagonization, that you that you're going to be silent like every other activist group when it comes to environment. So like companies don't care about you. People think that you're hippies. Or B, what's even more harmful is that you get ridiculed, that you get targeted for being women who are whiny or women who they can't be taken seriously. We think that this gives you a tangible reason for men to stop caring about environmentalists in the first place, but also stop caring about women. So then you detract from other fights. So things like getting better jobs, or things like getting better education for women on the ground. These fights then become not less important, but taken less seriously, because you're then associated with this idea of eco-terrorism, or this idea you're always fighting for things that we already don't care about. But also on the fight of conserving environment, it further detracts these fights. Why do we say so? Because the real entities of this environmental destruction are people who are CEOs of logging companies, people who are workers of companies that support gas and things like that. Right? When you target and blame and harass and lobby against these companies, you then have these profit-driven companies fighting back against you. You have these profit-driven companies specifically targeting this group and this group is lobbying against them. Well, male dominance is so strong, and when you question and threaten it, these companies will retaliate. We tell you that these companies will either try to buy you out or try to drown you out amongst them. Tell you that these are companies who have the popularity and publicity in order to antagonize this feminist group, and we think that that's extra harmful. But also this popularity from these CEOs and these companies will also move to the grassroots. We tell you that essentially the grassroots people who necessarily think that women already have a perception that women are weak, women already have all these negative stereotypes of being whiny or being useless or being emotional. You then have an added layer of negativity where you directly threaten and blame men. I think that essentially you take out all the progression that we've had in these developing countries. We think that is harmful for both movements as a whole.
Thank you, member. Fall time equals about mentioning I'll follow the government with.
Let's start. We can start this year. Here.
What side opposition failed to realize is that the mode of development has been patriarchal in developing countries. That's the problem with development and any form of short-term benefits that they want to achieve with feminism or the feminist movement, better jobs, better education, like what CO or OO are trying to talk about, is still going to be dictated by the patriarchy unless we change it to become more sustainable. Let's like before I even conclude the debate by proving finally the link between the environmental rights and women's rights and whites, and uniquely important to developing countries, and explaining the unique benefits of having ecofeminism as the brand of feminism, let's just look at what Site tried to tell us, right? So they told us that, basically their whole point was very similar to OO, which is why I'm going to be rebutting both of them together. They told us that you're going to be antagonizing people, and because, these two just don't link and they don't make sense. First of all, we've never heard a brand of feminism coming out from them that does not antagonize men or anyone else in the first place. We think that any form of rights movement has to antagonize people, to challenge current power structures, to even gain some form of traction. So we don't think that, if you did not give us any form of counter narrative, we don't think that counter narrative even exists where you cannot antagonize men and still gain rights. But secondly, we don't think that antagonizing men is necessarily a bad thing, or antagonizing people in general is necessarily a bad thing. Because Wilson explained to you, even though you antagonize people, you also unite people who have similar causes. That's why you have united lobbying power, increased lobbying power, environmentalists who now understand women's rights more, and even people who now see climate change as more important because it has been given a human face. You actually know who are the people who are uniquely harmed by climate change. It's no longer amorphous, something Wilson talked about, and therefore linking them together means you still have some form of people creating more buy-in into people. We think that linking is also strategic, right, to create targeted solutions for unique problems faced by different women in different societies. That's why we have Islamic brand of feminism in Islamic countries. That's why we're radical postmodern feminism when it comes to Western liberal democracies. We think that ecofeminism in developing countries is a unique brand of feminism that specifically targets unique problems faced by your women in developing countries. Then last thing, we talk about, we have other priorities that we can focus on. I'll be explaining why these other priorities are secondary to the main priority of first making sure that climate change does not, fuck over lives in general, and we think that that's something that's very important. So let's just move on to it. What exactly is the link between the environment and environmental rights and women's rights in general? Because these guys just asserted that there was no link, and these guys talked about a tenuous link. I'll explain it in greater detail, right? So first of all, Wilson already told you that there are men control technology, men control all the preemptive measures to protect themselves from climate change. Therefore, they are shielded from climate change more than women are. Women are seen as disposable, less useful to the economy, and therefore when a tsunami hits or there's a warning system, men get one more than women. So women are already disproportionately affected when, people get hurt. But we think that even after a disaster, women take a longer time to recover because aid distribution is controlled by men. And corruption exists in developing countries in a patriarchal system, in a power structure that benefits men at the expense of women. When you make a calculus between who is more useful to the economy, and the calculus is based on your development goals, which is dominated or male dictated, we think that in this case, women can never win. So we think that climate change uniquely affects women because of the patriarchal power structure. We also think that the agricultural industries that exist within these developing countries uniquely affect women as well, right? You hire more women in, for example, your agricultural industries, and they're more sustainable to the environment. But they're also less profitable than mining, logging, all these male-dominated industries that actually destroy the environment. So the prioritization has always been destroy environment, destroy careers of women, destroy economic rights of women, and these are things that actually create the link between environment and women in developing countries. Lastly, we think that especially in developing countries, women often get left behind. They want to talk about education and jobs and stuff. We think that even if you introduce this, microfinancing and all that, women will only be pushed to agriculture, to the things that they can that can confine women to the roles, because industrialization has screwed over women time and again, right? When your garment factories burn or your sweatshops are only filled with women itself. We think that industrialization is a male-dominated structure that actually oppresses women even more. So in order to actually change development or the mode of development to make it more women-friendly, we have to first correct the sustainable part of it. Yes. when women aren't given basics rights, it's unlikely environmentals are fought because, as you conceded, that's not the focus of developing nations. If both are antagonistic, how exactly would support be gained? Be the first person to actually explain the link now that both are gated.
Look, they are not antagonistic because you've never proven how an environmental right is fundamentally contradictory to a women's right. We told you how women's rights are ultimately human rights. Environmental rights protect human rights. So we think that the basis has been made by our side. We've told you how it uniquely harms women. Therefore, when you protect environmental rights or you protect women's rights, why not put them two together? So if you guys can't explain the antagonism, we don't expect to defend something that doesn't exist in the first place, right? So let's plus. Secondly, we think that we are happy to prioritize long-term goals of making sure that there is a sustainable environment, and instead of prioritizing short-term goals like OO wanted to talk about. OO wanted to prioritize development because they said development will be the catalyst for women empowerment. I've shown you how the system is rigged right from the start, where men control development and therefore control the oppression of women through development. We think that because of that, you prioritizing short-term goal of development will not help in any way. We think that just because, and also lastly, we think that just because ecofeminism does not just help women but help men as a whole, it also means there's a unique advantage to how people perceive the women's rights movement. Wilson talked about it, how women's rights are no longer seen as, isolated, ostracized, because now they also affect other people. We think that makes women's rights movements even more friendly to other people. So we think that we're happy to prioritize long-term goal of having an environment to protect women under, rather than making sure you protect laws, but still women constantly get screwed over. So we think that because of that, we already win the debate. Lastly, we think that because we humanize and personify the problem, and we change the perceptions of women's rights, ultimately there is a link between women's rights and the environment in developing countries. We've proven this link to you, and we've proven why ecofeminism is the unique brand of feminism that needs to exist in developing countries. For all these reasons, very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Dr. I was debating how long the opposition would here.
In a world where both the environment and women are constantly neglected, we do not want to further conflate the two, and we do not want to make any antagonization towards these two things any worse. We'll show you how we do it in my speech. First, I'm going to tell you why the whole government bench falls, right? So basically, I'm going to take down closing government first. Basically, what they did was rehash OG a bit and played the poor people card. So in response to that, I'll tell you that they have no short-run benefit, right? Because trees and crops don't grow overnight, so there's no short-term benefit there. Poor women don't have enough food because they don't have the resources right? So and it's not because they don't have enough trees or crops in their backyard. And in refugee camps, refugees need resources like food and medical supplies, not really trees. Those supplies can be flown in from other places. You don't have to actually grow trees at those camps. And we want to keep women alive over trees because it's the more humane thing to do. Closing government puts fellow human beings below plants, right? We do not want everything that's abhorrent. And when we fight for, they claim that we antagonize men, but they antagonize men even more. Because when we fight for feminism, we fight for just feminism rather than ecofeminism, which means that we antagonize less people. How minimize right there, right? So ecofeminism is a radical feminism, and unlike every other feminism, this is a radical feminism that has compounded the antagonization that is directly aimed at men. They directly blame men. Before I go on opening,
you argued that these men don't care about feminist rights or environmental rights, right? But all your alternatives create an antagonistic movement as well. So won't you create a point of relatability the moment you link the thing they care about the most to things like environment, and as well as linking it back to how you treat women?
I will tell you exactly why that relatability is so harmful in these instances for both women and the environment. Now, a lot of what OG has done is just conflate women and the environment, and this is how we handle that, right? It is exactly this relatability that harms women. Like the Prime Minister said, the patriarchal men don't care about women in developing nations, just like how they don't care about the environment, because these people are objectified, they are seen as replenishable and servient. When you liken women to the environment, you only encourage and further enforce the idea that women are to be commodified, that we don't need to care about them. Because they say that, well, if people can view women like the environment as a resource that needs to be replenished to sustain life, then people will automatically take care of women more. Wrong! For decades, centuries, people have known that harming the environment was bad. But what has that done to stop giant companies from harming the environment? We see companies like Nestle, Starbucks, like just enslaving people, abusing their environment all the time, and they're not incentivized to change their ways because they incentivize more by money. Money is king in this case. How do you take down money? Closing.
Yeah, so the point is, millions of women will have their lives overturned and thousands more will die because of climate change. How will the feminist movement do anything about it under your paradigm? Surely the feminist movement will care about the fact that these lives are going to be screwed up or dead.
Obviously, but we need to prioritize women over the environment because, like they said, political capital is limited. Sit down. Is limited. So we do need to have a sense of prioritization. Sit down. So you, excuse me. They asked us if we're, excuse me. They said that we can't overshoot the environment because it's needed to sustain life. When so I feel like people don't care. And we draw a parallel to clothing giants, all right? Like that. There's an industrial giant that doesn't care about politics, right? Because they enslave children. And what have they done in response to that slavery? They half-heartedly just do just enough to calm whatever public outrage there is, and then months later, when people actually carry out investigations, people find out that Gap is still enslaving children. We believe the same thing will happen with these companies that harm the environment. They'll just do just enough to calm the public outrage, to make themselves look a little bit better, and then when investigations eventually done, they'll be found to be still harming the environment in the same way. And we also draw a parallel to Nestle and Starbucks because Nestle and Starbucks, they harm people, they harm the environment, and then what they do is pretty much the same thing, except they add in lawyers to the equation. So every time you take action against these corporate companies, what they do is they either hide their actions better, or they just hire lawyers to solve the cases for them. And then when investigations are done, you'll be found to be doing the same things over and over again. Money is always prioritized over disposables, like they mentioned, and minorities. So by conflating the two, the environment and women, people in power, the game changes. Just think to themselves, wow, two things that I shouldn't care about put together. So the best case scenario is this: it's a zero-sum game. The worst case scenario is that they will care even less, because even if they did care a little bit about one, now that you conflate the two, you diminish whatever care they had initially for either one of those things. So what I'll proceed to do is tell you why now CO takes the debate. So we have told you, or my member has told you, that you mar the feminist movement in the eyes of feminists. Why? Because these companies get antagonized. What do they do when these companies are antagonized? They sue people in the feminist movement. They sue feminist groups, and they bog the feminist groups down with bad publicity. So these feminist groups gain negative traction, they gain negative attention. People will be further detracted from feminist movements, right? You further, like even in the eyes of fanciers, you make the perception of feminists worse for those people. Feminist groups then lose strength because the core of the strength is the numbers. They have strength in numbers. They need the numbers of resources and also critical mass. So these companies, what you also do in antagonism, sometimes they get so desperate that they resort to buying you out. Feminist people are also people. People sometimes have a price. These companies have almost limitless amounts of money. So what they can do is just buy people out. And people in the feminist movement, they'll be extremely tempted to go to the other side. They'll be extremely tempted to give up their feminist goals for the amount of money that's being offered them. They are only human. You also get, when you antagonize these men even more on their side, you get men on the ground to feel threatened. Most of these men work for these companies, right? So these companies will tell these men that their economical income is threatened and women are to blame. Because women are fighting for the environment, they are blaming men. So these corporate heads will tell people on the ground, hey, you should antagonize women even because they are the cause of your suffering. So enforce your patriarchy, make them suffer more because they are making you suffer. So what we have told you, we've told you that when you conflict the two, you actually make the fight even worse. It causes more antagonization. And we've also told you that these companies, we already have very limited political mass, so we need to focus all our mass, prioritize women over the environment. For all those reasons, I'm supremely proud. I've never been prouder to host. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We invite